Hannes Mosler is my name. As I was introduced, I'm at the University of Duisburg-Essen at the Institute of East Asian Studies and at the Institute of Political Science. And that tells you already that I'm a political scientist by training. And yeah, that's my disciplinary background. And I'm mostly interested in questions of the political system, political parties, elections, and all what's related to that. Also the Constitution and legal questions in that area. Also memory politics are some of my interests. And if you're interested in what I'm interested in, then you can check out my profile site at my university, the University of Duisburg-Essen here in the west of Germany. So yeah, what I'd like to do in my talk is, and I should share my screen. This one. Okay, now you should see my first slide. I hope it's also in the right mode. If not, please tell me. So I'd like to talk about this, which is the presidential election that took place in South Korea just the day before yesterday, actually, and everything is quite still fresh. And yesterday I spent the day putting this all together for this talk today. So please forgive me if my presentation is, let's say, somewhat dynamic. But of course, if I miss anything, we can take it up then in the Q&A session later on. So my basic idea for the talk here is following these simple guiding questions. What happened? Who is the new president? What does he stand for? What are his ideas, his plans? Who voted him into office? Maybe based on assessing what he pledged in the campaign. And yeah, how can we explain that he won the election? And maybe in the end, we can also talk a little bit about possible implications. First, a quick look, if the computer lets me. Oh, yes, here we go. The historical context, which you know, of course, very well. You can see South Korea came a long way since its establishment in 1948. You see the two main political camps, the conservatives at the bottom, the liberals here in blue at the top. They both have their roots in opposing camps, so to speak, during the authoritarian period, the authoritarian regimes on the one side and the opposition or the democratization movement on the other. And you see also that with now the latest president, with conservative President Yoon Suk-yeol elected into office, this is the fourth government turnover since democratization in 1987. Yeah, but let's talk about the new president. Who is the new president? And well, we know that he was born in 1960 into a relatively wealthy middle-class family in Seoul. His father, I learned, was a statistics professor at the renowned Yonsei University, which is, by the way, the place I learned Korean. Yeah, maybe that's not so important. The young Yoon Suk-yeol then entered the elitist Seoul National University in the late 1970s to study law. Yeah, and this is actually where I did my PhD. Maybe I should have become president. But joking aside, back to Yoon, he was exempted from military service because he was unfit due to his poor eyesight. And yeah, well, I suppose that gave him more time for studying and enjoying life. In the early 1990s, then finally, after several attempts, he passed the state examination for the civil service. And so then he began his career as a public prosecutor in 1994. This is, by the way, the year when I visited South Korea for the first time. Interesting. But don't worry, I stop here referring to my personal accounts. Forgive me for that. In 2012, he married his current wife, Kim Gon-hee, a bit late for South Korean standards, though. He was 52. But, well, nevertheless, it seems to hold, at least until now. Now, the first time Yoon became or rather say, came to the attention of the general public in his capacity as a prosecutor, was when he investigated the case of election rigging at the presidential election in 2012. This is the election when Park Geun-hye was elected president. So during the election campaign in 2012, the Secret Service of the Lee Myung-bak administration had illegally mobilized and campaigned on the internet for Park. I guess without her knowing. But then in 2016, he led also the investigation against Park Geun-hye for her corruption and her misuse of power while being in office. And Yoon also played a major role in prosecuting former President Lee Myung-bak in 2017, for corruption again, as we all know. And we also know Lee Myung-bak is still in prison. So we can say Yoon was a real killer prosecutor, as you can see from this history. As a result of that, you could say, Yoon then continued to climb the ladder of his career and was appointed Prosecutor General in 2019. It's more or less the highest office a public prosecutor can hold, as a public prosecutor, of course. And in the same year, he also investigated then Minister of Justice Jo Guk, who later had to resign, because of that to a certain extent. And this is the incident that initiated the break between the Moon government and Yoon Suk-yeol at that time. And in 2020, he had a huge conflict also with the new Justice Minister, Chu Mye. And in 2021, then finally he had enough and he resigned from his post. And he began to build his career as a politician. This was last year, 2021 was last year. So then at the end of June 2021, he decided to run as a presidential candidate. And a month later, he joined the conservative opposition party, the People Power Party, or PPP, and he finally then became its presidential candidate in November last year. And the day before yesterday, so 4 months later, he was finally elected president with a difference in the vote share of 0.73 points. So this is the brief and crazy story of Yoon Suk-yeol, who went from a prosecutor general to president in less than 8 months. Now you can imagine that this kind of background is rather not so common for presidents, at least in South Korea. And indeed, it is quite unusual that a political outsider, you must say, like him, becomes president, and so quickly and so easily, I would add. As I said, for 26 years, he had always been a prosecutor, and he has no experience at all in politics. And in comparison, most of the previous presidents in South Korea, they had at least some experience in politics, either as a member of parliament, or as a mayor or governor, except for the dictators, of course. Yoon, on the other hand, is an absolute novice in this regard. And this can, obviously this can be problematic because it means he has to rely a lot more on his advisors. He could be heavily dependent. And in worst case, he could be at the mercy of those around him. He doesn't have a faction or inner circle that he built for years. Of course, now he's building one. But he doesn't have a faction or such a group which he can blindly trust. So this could be highly problematic. One can, of course, interpret this inexperience also in a positive way, because he was a prosecutor for decades. He is considered to be a clean man, a clean sheet, as you say. He's still fresh, so to speak. He has no political skeletons in his closet. And thus he could possibly be even freer in his actions, in what he does. So this could also mean that he may be able to run the office of the president much better than the typical politicians who had to work their way up in politics over the decades, which of course brings also risky baggage with it, right? Well, we don't know yet. We will see how this will be turning out in the end. But let me now move on to the question, what does Yoon stand for? What has he planned for the next 5 years in office? According, of course, to his campaign pledges. And of course, I can only highlight a couple of noteworthy examples here. So first, let's look at domestic politics. Yoon, in his campaign, has often criticized the concentration of power in the presidential office. And indeed, there were many problems under the Moon administration as a result of this phenomenon of the so-called imperial president, which is true for any preceding president in South Korea, actually. So Yoon said he will diffuse this highly concentrated power. For example, he said he will not interfere in the business of the governing party so that the party can act autonomously from the president. He also wants to give the ministers more personal responsibility in their departmental work. The same goes then for the office of the prime minister as well as for the prosecutor's office. More independence for everyone will reduce excessive power concentration in the presidential office. That is his recipe. Then his pledges regarding the economy are quite typical for a conservative. Yoon propagates strong deregulation of the economy. He wants to create business-friendly conditions that then probably trigger growth and which then leads to economic prosperity for everyone. He argues. And so accordingly, he wants to create jobs by having more and stronger companies, which then should lead to greater demand for workforce. Also, abolishing taxes is yet another typical example for conservative policy strategies. Also, he wants to rather encourage private sector housing constructions and not so much public housing construction. And he wants to promote this through free market incentives. Then, quite shockingly, you could say, Yoon said he will abolish the Ministry of Gender, Equality and Family. He claims that there is no significant structural discrimination against women in Korea. On the contrary, he and his conservative friends argue that there has been increasing reverse discrimination against men. And that was caused, among other things, they are arguing, by the Ministry of Gender Equality. Well, take that. On a different note, Yoon also plans to increase the punishment for sex crimes, but also making false claims of having been raped. And in this spirit of law and order mentality, Yoon also promised to reduce the age of criminal responsibility from the current age of 14 to 12 years. And also drunk driving will be punished more severely, at least he says. In terms of energy and climate policy, Yoon is again pursuing a quite completely different strategy compared to the current government. So the current government under Moon has been propagating a nuclear phase-out. And Yoon, on the contrary, wants to expand and strengthen nuclear energy in order to achieve climate goals. Yeah, we know that story from somewhere, right? We heard that. To reduce then carbon dioxide emissions, existing nuclear power plants will be maintained and additional reactors will be built, and also new innovative nuclear energy technologies are to be developed. This is his plans for this energy policy. Oh, and I picked this up here. This book might be familiar to you. It became a big issue when the Ministry of Gender and Equality in 2020 distributed this book to schools in Korea for sex education purposes. The conservative PPP protested so heavily that the books had to be recalled shortly afterwards. So just for you to see what we are talking about here, what we are dealing with the conservatives and their interpretation of the gender issues. But now let's turn to the foreign policy and security policy quickly. This is naturally even more different from the policy of the current liberal government. As you would expect, Yoon prefers to maintain and strengthen close relations to the US and also improve relations with Japan. Relations with China, on the other hand, are a little bit different. He wants to hold China on an arm's length. Instead, he wants to proactively seek membership in the so-called Quad strategy meeting. In terms of security policy on the Korean Peninsula, then Yoon is known for planning on strengthening South Korea's military deterrence potential. And this includes the establishment of appropriate weapon systems and strategies, such as the so-called kill chain strategy, the deployment of an air and missile defense system, and a Korea massive punishment and retaliation plan, is it called? And on top of that, the existing THAAD missile defense system will also be further expanded. So together, he argues this should enable South Korea to make preventive strikes against North Korea if necessary. And Yoon's position on how to deal with North Korea also follows the basic principle of North Korea having to first abolish its nuclear weapons. Only then South Korea would lift sanctions and help North Korea promoting its economy. As long as North Korea does not lay down its arms, there should be no progress in inter-Korean dialogue. And this is a typical conservative, hardline, hawkish position. And this is also reflected in the plan to designate North Korea again as a main enemy in the official white paper on defense. So these are just a few highlights from the new president's government agenda. And so you could say against this backdrop, you might wonder who voted for him, right? This is now what I briefly will talk about in this next part. And after that, I'll wrap up the talk so we can talk to each other. So who voted Yoon into office? Let's start with regionalism, the well-known phenomenon, because this is also the clearest pattern in voting decisions also at this election again. And that is why it is not surprising that Yoon received an overwhelming majority of votes in the so-called Yeongnam region, in the southeastern part of the peninsula. You see this here on in these two maps. And this regionalism has always been a great advantage for the conservatives. And the reason is, you can see that here on the left side, that the number of voters in this Yeongnam region is bigger than twice than the number of voters in the Honam region, which is the competitor's region in the southwest of the country. So if you become a candidate of the Conservative Party, which has its stronghold in the Yeongnam region, then you have this great advantage. But as I said earlier, Yoon was actually a political outsider. He entered the the party's internal race for the candidacy quite late, and yet the conservative PPP eventually chose him as their presidential candidate. That might seem strange at first. On a closer inspection, however, it is rather easy to see why the Conservative Party went along with it. The main reason being the conservatives have been in a crisis for some time. Conservative Lee Myung-bak's presidency was a disaster, and then there was the chaos surrounding conservative President Park Geun-hye and her impeachment in 2017. And in the end, the conservatives were completely discredited. And this was then also reflected in all the following election results since the last presidential elections 5 years ago, until the recent by-elections last year. And now, of course, we see in this presidential election a turn in this trend. But coming back to Yoon, so as an outsider who had previously nothing to do with the PPP, he was, in a way, you could say, predestined for this task. Yoon was not only an untarnished outsider, but as a former prosecutor general, he is also a respectable person from the point of view of the conservatives. And the big bonus of Yoon was that he wasn't just any prosecutor, but he was the president killer prosecutor, as I mentioned earlier. So you could say he established his reputation as a kind of dragon slayer, yeah? That gave him the sufficient advantage over the other candidates within the PPT and also later on. So that's what I can say for the aspect of regionalism, and we may come back to that. A second noteworthy phenomenon is that Yoon was elected by the majority of the older voters over 60 years of age. So these older voters, of course, usually do vote for candidates rather vote from the Conservative Party, which is mainly because they experienced the Korean War directly, or they belong to the immediate post-war generation. And also this generation is, of course, we know, strongly influenced by the experience of the successful industrialization and economic growth until the 1990s. And that means they have sympathies, right, for the conservative forces, which have their roots in the regimes during the developmental dictatorship, as we saw. So it's no wonder this old generation mostly voted for the conservative candidate. The third determining factor is gender. And this concerns almost only the younger voters up to the age of 39 only, as you can see here. The majority of young men here voted for Yoon, while on the other side, then the majority of the younger women voted for Lee Jae-myung. And the fact that the young men are more attracted to the conservative Yoon is mainly due to their feeling of being increasingly discriminated against by women of the same age. And that might seem to be hard to believe at first. I mean, South Korea is well known for being a strong patriarchal society, right? But in fact, society has become more and more women-friendly in the recent past, even if, of course, there's still a very long way to go. But from this perspective of many young men, this development presents itself a reverse discrimination, because they were used to being favored, or because they had the expectation that they would also enjoy the advantages of a patriarchal society. And well, we know that there's a similar phenomenon going on in the US. So in other words, the young men feel discriminated against and seek protection and help from the conservatives. And that's why also Yoon campaigned, for example, for the abolition of the women's ministry, as I mentioned earlier. And that is one of the reasons they voted for him, well, smart or not. And then lastly, and well, on a more comprehensive level, of course, we have to say the disastrous failure of the Moon administration was one of the most crucial background factors, for sure, for the victory of the funny candidate, Yoon Sung-yeol. Of course, not everything was bad, and I'm sure Moon had only the best intentions. But as we know, after a very a very good but also short start in the first 2 years of his incumbency, things got worse and worse by the day. So obviously, this time's election's outcome, to a great extent, was the result also of a protest vote by the people. And this also explains in part why Yoon won only by a tiny margin of 0.73%. The people did not necessarily want a conservative government. They were mostly disappointed by President Moon's performance.